Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com, where you can find in-depth reporting and other resources concerning every topic you'll hear discussed on the program, brought to you today by the San Antonio Express News. San Antonio Express News education reporter Silvia Foster-Frau's grandfather is Puerto Rican, and due to hurricane damage, left the unincorporated U.S. territory until power was restored to his home. Silvia recently visited the island herself and joins me now to discuss some of the issues she reported on and is continuing to report on during the trip. So, Silvia Foster-Frau, great to have you back here on the program.
Hey, Chance. Thanks for having me.
So, obviously, you have a family connection to Puerto Rico. Tell me about what brought you first to the island.
Yeah, so my grandfather is Puerto Rican. The whole side of my mom's family is, and so he lives there along with a smattering of uncles and aunts and cousins. And this past fall, when the Hurricane Maria hit the island on September 20th, my grandfather, he actually was out of Puerto Rico at the time. He was returning from a trip and was basically diverted and ended up staying with my family, which lives in Galesburg, Illinois, for those 6 months pretty much, until things got better in his hometown, which is Jayuya. It's in the central part, mountainous part of Puerto Rico. It was like a little over a month ago when light finally came back to Jayuya. So it had been about 5 months, I want to say, since the hurricane hit, when electricity reached his town. And so then that was when we decided that it would probably be safe for him to go back. But we obviously still had concerns about, what else would be open in the town. Beyond electricity, we need to make sure that the doctor was in and the grocery store open, and that, it was livable enough for him. He's 92 years old, but Puerto Rico is his whole life. And so me and my mom and him went to Puerto Rico to kind of return him to his homeland. And so I wrote a column about that in the Express News, just from a personal point of view at the prospect of that trip back home.
Yeah, and that was a first for you. It was your first column, first opinion piece for the Express News about your upcoming trip to Puerto Rico. It was written before you had actually gotten there. Tell me more about that. It's interesting in that you talk about how your grandfather, this is really where he wants to die. This is his homeland.
Yeah, so it was a different experience for me writing, inserting my own voice. And first person journalists, we're so used to writing about other people. So it was kind of strange for me to sit down and write it, but it was just something I really cared about. And it had been really affecting my family's life in a way that I felt like people needed to know that, the problems of, I feel like a lot of times people think of, mainland U.S. and then there's Puerto Rico as if it's separate, but there are a lot of Puerto Rican immigrants and second and third generation Puerto Ricans living all over. And that ripple effect of the pain and destruction that's happening on the island, is not contained to that island. So when I interacted with my parents on a regular basis since the hurricanes hit, I could sense the stress and the urgency and all of the complexity of emotion that comes from having our extended family going through this hurricane and what that means. My abuelo, my grandfather, stuck in Galesburg, Illinois, rural Midwest area, and just totally different culture, and having to take care of him. And yeah, being 92, he's in good health, but it is a concern. And he frequently told my parents that he wanted to die in his homeland, which is a really difficult thing to hear from someone, and also understandable. I think Puerto Ricans have a special attachment and sense of pride and community with their island because of their status as, not being a state, but more of kind of Commonwealth territory. That with that comes this really strong sense of culture and land and heritage. And so he, my abuela, my mom's mother who passed away, her cemetery, her grave is there. And so, it was a big deal.
So as you mentioned earlier, Sylvia, he hadn't returned to Puerto Rico for such a long time because, there was quite a lot of damage, and there still is quite a lot of damage because of the hurricane. A lot of recovery still going on. It's been very slow, and that's something that's been reported in the news and often been criticized, rightly so. So tell me about that. I'm sure your grandfather is not the only person who went so long without having power where they live, medical attention, as you talked about. This is still something that's lingering on even today as we speak.
Yeah, so light came on in Jayuya in the central area at the beginning of this year. And as of today, I saw that 95% of the island has had power restored. So there is still a 5% of people that have been in the dark for 7 months now. That's for a variety of reasons. The infrastructure on the island and the state of the island before the hurricane, I think, really affected then how things went down afterwards. It exacerbated a lot of pre-existing issues that Puerto Rico had. And then even since then, beyond the issue of electricity, there's been an issue of, shady contracts and with U.S. companies. There's been an issue of meal distribution, drinking water, is it potable or not? There's also, FEMA has been, it usually requires people to show deeds to show that they own homes in order to get housing assistance. But a lot of people in Puerto Rico don't have the deeds to their homes, or, it's been passed down through generations, or, they own their land because they made they had a handshake deal. And so that prevented a lot of people then also from getting housing assistance from FEMA. So there are all of this kind of confluence of issues that have come together and made recovery really slow for Puerto Rico. Another effect too that has really struck me is the suicide crisis that's going on. They say that the number of suicides since the hurricane occurred has almost tripled. And so it kind of makes you think about, after even all of these practical necessities get solved, once everyone has electricity and food and water, then it's like, what are the mental health repercussions of going through this? And so that's something that I think we'll be hearing about in months and maybe years to come.
And so speaking about things we'll be hearing about in the future, you originally made this trip, you did your first column opinion piece before you went to Puerto Rico to bring back your grandfather to his hometown once power had been restored there. While you were there, though, I guess you got the itch to cover some more topics. Tell me about some things that you saw that you were researching there, and I'm sure even now that you're continuing to work on, that might soon appear in the San Antonio Express News down the road.
Yeah, so one of the things that really struck me when I first got to the island is how different the landscape looked. The trees, it's such a lush and tropical climate. And I grew up going there in the summers to visit family, and seeing what happened to the landscape is pretty upsetting. It's a really lush area. So things that have, I think, like plants have grown back quickly, but you still see a lot of broken trees, just like there's stubs. It was like someone took a pencil sharpener to like all of the trees on the mountain and just whittled them down. It's really, it's a surreal experience just driving through those mountains where my abuelo lives. Part of what I want to report on is just that kind of texture of just what it looks like, what it feels like to be there, seeing posters that are Puerto Rico levantándose or Puerto Rico se levanta, like all of these kind of works of art and posters that people are doing to unite and have a sense of community and feel like they're, bringing people together and that they're going to overcome this. And just all of those things that come with, that you see after these kinds of disasters. There's still a lot of homes too, you see, with bright blue tarps on their home. So I want to write a little bit just about that experience of returning my abuela home and seeing how the land has changed. But there's also a few other interviews that I did that really stand out to me. One was with a woman who's a principal of a school, And her experience, she had a teacher that lost her leg in the hurricane, and she had students that lost everything, and how that school is dealing with the effects of the hurricane. Now she said their attendance is back up again, which is good. But, there's still that mental health issue. She told me that when the kids heard rain, when I was there, it was raining for a few days in a row. She said when the kids heard rain, they started crying because they thought there would be another hurricane. And they have one social worker, she said, at the school. So I want to do some kind of story about that. And then another interview I had that stood out to me was a man who talked to me about how he also had left the island after the hurricane, much like my abuelo had, but he returned as well. And he spoke a lot about what the island means to him, and why it was important for him to return to. And it makes me wonder, there's been this mass exodus of hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans that have fled the island and gone to Florida and all over the mainland. And it makes me wonder how many of those will return. So those are things that are kind of brewing, but they have not been written yet. So we'll see what actually comes out at the end.
I'm interested. You talked about all the damage with the trees. I was in the Peace Corps in Colombia, and some of these landscapes that are up and down, Central South America, Puerto Rico, they're just amazing. But, I can imagine kind of what you're describing. And I'm interested, how did your grandfather's home and land kind of survive through the hurricane? Were people checking on it while he was gone? Was it maybe just your guys are going to roll up and see what it looks like? What was that like as you brought him back to his home?
So his home itself was fine, thank God. We luck out that one of my uncles is also living there with him right now, and he's been there the whole time. So he's been able to kind of to fix things up as things came up, and kind of just stay there during that. So he's got, his own whole set of stories about what that was like for those months without power. And then my other uncles and aunts also kind of came through, and they tried to check on each other as much as they could, considering the roads and everything. But his backyard is different. I grew up with me and my brother. We would go exploring in the backyard, and it's just this huge expanse of land with these huge trees and leaves. And it's like, it's that tropical kind of forest where it feels like Jurassic Park, like everything is just bigger, and there's fruits and, just so lush. And that's definitely not the same. All the fruits are gone, and there's just a lot of broken nature, a lot of just trees flat down, you can't get through anymore. So that's definitely changed, and will probably stay that way for a while.
You mentioned how difficult it's been for some Puerto Ricans to, prove their home is their home, to get assistance. And I'm sure that there are several examples of that outside of just proving the home, is owned by your family itself. But since your grandfather's home, despite the damage that you just mentioned, did decently okay compared to a lot of others, I'm wondering, did he receive any assistance? Did he receive any assistance while he was staying in the U.S. for several months? Or was this something where the family just sort of took care of him, and then the money that was needed was spent by the family? What's his relationship been like with the federal government?
That's a good question. As far as I'm aware of, I should probably double check with my mom, but as far as I'm aware of, he hasn't received any housing assistance or federal assistance. I mean, I know my uncle, who was at his home during all of this, he, relied to survive on the food and the bottled water and the gas that was provided by FEMA distribution centers in Jayuya. So I can say,
and so he would go to the distribution center and get some sort of like daily allotment of what he needed.
Yeah, and that was actually, when you hear him talk about it, it's a pretty wild experience, because he would go there and wait for like hours in line to just get, 5 gallons of gas in his car. And you heard stories of people like trying to follow these huge gas trucks back to their source to see if they would bring more gasoline, or sometimes he'd wait in line for hours and then still not get the bottled water they were waiting for. And so you'd have to return the next day. Like you hear these like stories of people just waiting in line forever to get what they needed. And even to get to those centers, it involved, a lot of them couldn't drive on the roads. And one of my uncles talked about like taking out, like, he was like, wherever you go, you just took a machete with you and you like cut down trees and you tried to clear paths and just hope that each time you went through, you made it a little bit wider for someone else and a little bit better for someone else to go through. And this is all too without power. So you can imagine like everyone was trying to return before dark, because when it got dark, no one had power. I mean, it was black, there were no city lights. So it sounds like a really just surreal experience. They talked a lot about like the adrenaline and stress that comes with living every day. Like, okay, what's next? What else is going to happen? What else do I need to do? What's needed? How can I help my neighbors? Who's in a worse situation than I am? How can we pool resources? All of that just comes when everything you kind of depend on in life just gets, ripped from under your feet.
I've been speaking with San Antonio Express News education reporter Silvia Foster-Frau during today's episode of In Depth. But as we spoke last time about Sutherland Springs, Silvia has really outgrown her education reporter tag at the San Antonio Express News. Of course, we've been talking about her heritage. Her grandfather is Puerto Rican, and she recently traveled back with him to return him to his home after the devastation that occurred after the hurricane there. As we mentioned, people still recovering, some people more affected than others. Luckily, it sounds like Silvia's grandfather recovered a lot more easily than a lot of other people on the island, and that's something to keep in mind looking into the future. So, Silvia, before we say goodbye, any final thoughts, anything that we haven't discussed so far that you'd like to mention before we say goodbye today?
I guess I'm just lucky that I was able to get to take this trip, and that my abuelo, being 92, was able to go back to his home that was intact. And I feel lucky that I was able to do that. And I, hope we all keep thinking of and reporting on Puerto Rico and its recovery as it emerges from the hurricane.
And of course, I think that's an excellent point to end on. So once again, I've been speaking with San Antonio Express News education reporter Silvia Foster-Frau. And Silvia, we look forward to hearing about some of these stories that you've been mentioning in the coming days and weeks at the San Antonio Express News.
Thank you, Chance.
And thanks again to San Antonio Express News education reporter Silvia Foster-Frau for sharing her personal story with me for today's episode of In Depth, brought to you by the San Antonio Express News. For expressnews.com, I'm Chance Storland.